So we're here at the Festival of Books at the U of A in the campus, and it's March 14th, 2015. And we're here sitting with Lydia Millet, the author of Pills and Starships, which, by the way, I loved personally. And I just wanted to ask, how did you think of the idea for this dystopia that you put into the future? Something...
Well, so there are different elements of it, right? So I wanted to sort of take a vacation in Hawaii, and so I decided to write a book based there, so I could sort of go in my imagination. And then sort of the stuff about climate change and sea level rise and species extinctions and all of that, all the sort of physical reality of the story, were just sort of based on scientific projections into the future, and then I wanted to add something social to that, like a social twist, and so I sort of conceived of this notion of this, corporate controlled world where you couldn't have babies anymore and all this kind of thing.
How did you come up with the idea of the corporations and all these death contracts?
Well, the death contracts, I guess, are the sort of, most fantastic element of it. The corporate, the corporate control of things isn't really much of a leap of imagination at all, is it?
Well, sure.
So that I just sort of took the logical next step the same way, I based the physical world on projections into the future. But the death contracts were... came out of thinking about population growth and carbon footprints and what you would do if you were a really powerful entity who or that wanted to, make the world more livable for yourself, and, what were ways to do this. Hopefully that's not a spoiler. Hopefully people have,
I
finished if they're reading.
Guys.
Yeah, so.
All right. Well, you say carbon footprint, and you put it into the book so many times, and I just wanted to ask, what is your viewpoint on the whole climate change now, and if maybe this book does come into being as this colossal climate change, why do you have it so that we still have like animatronics and things to repopulate the place with sentient beings, but like it doesn't quite work? Why do you see climate change as a big problem while the government says that it's not really that big?
Do you mean me personally,
yes,
or
you personally.
Well, I think scientists clearly believe climate change is a huge problem. I tend to side with scientists and people who know about climate science, and so that to me isn't very much of a leap. And I guess you could be asking, there's this little sort of encampment sort of outside the mainstream resort and corporate controlled society, right, in this book, and so in a sense, like, why are the people in the camps trying to cultivate living beings when those beings have a footprint? Is that part of what you were asking?
That's trying to get to. But...
Well, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea is they're just looking to sort of recreate a balanced world and a natural world, and then the corporates are just trying to eliminate, most biomass, which is human, right? Sure. They're just trying to sort of exert control over, because I think most of the creatures have been. I don't think they're making much of a carbon footprint anymore in the narrative. So, yes, it's basically it's two warring sort of visions, right, of what needs to happen.
What needs to happen. Yeah, exactly.
I was wondering, if this book ever did come to be, would you personally think that you would be a rebel like your main characters, or do you think that you'd fall victim to the whole pharma society, personally?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about it. Well, I'd like to think I'd be a rebel, of course. I've never been very warlike, or, so maybe I'd be like a quiet rebel. I'd just be like telling little stories to the children or something, I don't know.
Like a mom
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't really project myself into any of my books, really. But I'd like to think that I would stand up for what I believed in. obviously, rather than just walking around in a drug-induced stupor. I like to think so. I flatter myself. What about you?
I also like to say I'd be a rebel and I'd fight because I'd probably realize like, hey, something's not right here. But at the same time, I feel like I could easily fall victim to the whole like just doing the drugs and getting the death contracts and whatnot.
Yeah, because it's a powerful, dominant, sort of ideological thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's certainly easy to do. It's easier to do what you're told in a certain way. I mean, maybe not for you guys. I don't know, but there's a way in which, like, it's definitely easier to do what the culture tells you to do, even if it's not easier to do, say, what your parents tell you to do. But still, the sort of overarching culture, it's hard to say no to, right?
So you have this ideology. I personally, I just want to make a comment. The way that you put it in the beginning of the book, how the car crash for one of their death contracts.
Oh yeah,
that got me so hard to the core, and I just wanted to know. The ideology of living longer but yet still wanting to die, is that based on things that you've seen in culture, or do you base that on like an ideological standpoint?
Well, it is just another extension of sort of what's already happening demographically, right? So we do live longer, much longer than we did, even a century ago. And of course, there are many more of us now who are older. And so if you just sort of take that and run with it, it's just sort of like the climate change projections. It's just kind of a natural extension, whereas the notion of the actual death contracts and stuff is more, it's more far-fetched, basically, right?
Right.
But yeah, that stuff about more people living to an older age and stuff, that's just a slight exaggeration of what already is the case, is the trend, at least in this country and most places,
Writing a dystopia, what factors go into your writing and like how you base it and like go along with the storyline?
How you construct it, and whatever, the world building they call it. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that I spent a lot of time elaborately building this in the way that, say, Hunger Games was built. Although I do think it's probably just as careful as that Divergent trilogy, because I don't think they were very carefully constructed. But so mine was just sort of, this project for me was just it was just like a joyful summer project where I really wrote from character and voice the way that I always do. So I sort of didn't, for my so-called, literary books for older readers or whatever, mostly it's just very instinctive and sort of unplanned. I don't really create blueprints or outlines ahead of time or any of that stuff. I just kind of sit down and write whatever I want to write, and plot usually follows from voice, like from the tone and the language and all of that. So, and this was the case here. I mean, I knew I wanted to set it in Hawaii, as I said, sort of a wish fulfillment sort of fantasy.
Who doesn't want to go to Hawaii?
Yeah, exactly. And then I knew it was going to be climate related, that the future had to be shaped in part by that in this world. And then the drugs just sort of, I think I thought of the title of the book before I wrote the book, which is usually how I do it.
Starships.
So I liked that title, and so I decided to put pills in the book.
Right. And where did you get the Starships from?
The Starships, well, actually, there's still this device, right, where she talks to sort of this imaginary astronaut or cosmonaut, right, at the beginning of the book and again at the end. And that was all that the Starships part of it related to, the sort of like idea that the person she's writing to, the sort of imaginary friend that she has, is sort of like out there in the darkness of space and circulating, but it's someone for her to talk to, that person is out there somewhere and you don't know where they are or when they are or anything, but it's someone that you can talk to in your mind as this narrator. And so, really, that was the only starship. There's no starship other than that in the plot,
definitely.
as you know.
Did you come up with the idea for the cover art, or who?
No, I didn't. We had a different cover first that I loved by this great, graphic novelist guy. It was an awesome cover. But they did some testing and figured out that no one would buy it if it had that cover, even though it was brilliant. It was a brilliant cover. In fact, it was featured on the publishing company's, it was the cover of their catalog for that season and stuff, but we had to pull it pretty much at the last minute from the book because the marketing people claimed that teenagers wouldn't buy something without an image of a face or like photograph of a face, that it skewed too young. So it was like a marketing thing, even though like people read graphic novels and stuff all the time, right? But they claimed that it would just be, that would handicap the book to have this gorgeous cover that we had. So I'm still sad about that, because I mean, I'm happy with that one. I think it's really cool. And actually the woman who's the model in there, it was just like some sort of stock photo that they used for that, right? Like, so from a huge bank of photos somewhere they get. But then the woman who was actually the model for that, living in somewhere else in the world, friended me on Facebook, and she was like, "I am girl in your book cover." And I was like, "Great, that's so cool." I think she was in Ukraine or something like that. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, no, we went through a lot of different designs after the first one, and I liked this best. I like the colors, I think. And
yeah, the whole kind of red sand and red earth kind of like burning up, right?
Yeah, sort of Martian Chronically or something like that. I like that. Yeah.
So I have a question. When did you start writing? Did you start writing in high school, or?
I did. I had this great English teacher, Mr. Baker, and he was just he encouraged me a lot, and he was just, now that I think back and I look at the writing I was doing then, I'm like, what did he see? What exactly? But he was so encouraging. He was just this passionate guy, pretty young teacher, and I've been writing ever since then. But yeah, I don't think that I was. I mean, I'm not sure why he thought that I should be a writer. But he was so nice to me, and it was inspiring, and it was great. You just like, it's great to have someone believe in you, and in that way. And I think it meant a lot to me at the time. And then I also wrote in college, and I had a couple of great teachers in college. I didn't go to grad school for writing, as a lot of people do. A lot of people do these MFA programs like the one they have here at the U of A. And I did go for one semester here to the U of A, and then I dropped out and moved to Los Angeles and did much more nefarious deeds. But I did like the workshops I had in college too. Those were great. Yeah, so high school is, although I don't know about you guys, but I wrote a lot when I was younger too. Like even in elementary school, I wrote a lot. I just like mostly about princesses and whatever. And I illustrated them with it. All the princesses wore these conical hats. I don't know, with like a long flowing thing coming off the top, and then they had no breasts, of course, just they were like that, and then these triangular skirts. I remember them really well. Yeah, and I'm sure, and I wrote really melodramatic stuff basically as a teenager. I was writing. And I also tried to sound much older than I was, I think. Like in college, for example, I had this poem published in the journal of the college journal or whatever. And it was a sonnet about a middle-aged couple that had grown weary of their marriage. And I was like 18. So anyway, I'm just saying.
So when did you identify yourself as an author?
Probably starting in college that I really did identify that, because I wrote my first whole novels in college, and there's still one that I wrote that I haven't seen since then that was my honors thesis that's sitting in the library at the UNC Chapel Hill where I went to school. Ugh, it's dreadful to think of it there, sitting there like something radioactive that someone might find one day. So that was when I really started doing that, just writing all the time. And although I was still planning to be an opera singer then, I sang classically for a number of years, and I was planning to be an opera singer, but just like write on the side. But then I decided not to be an opera singer, so I wrote all the time. So, yeah.
What do you think is the best thing about being?
I think the best thing about being the kind of writer that I am anyway is just that you get to do what you want completely, and I never have to do what anyone else tells me to do in my writing, and just really never have to take direction. Like if I were writing movies, I'd have to have whole committees sort of dissecting the screenplays or whatever. But if you write novels, at least the kind that I write, you can really you have complete freedom to make them exactly the way you want to, and it's just it's an adventure, and yeah, I love it more than anything. I love writing more than anything. It just makes me really happy. So.
Do you have a special kind of writing routine, like a place that you go to, or?
Well, I wish. I work almost full time too, so I work as a writer and editor at this nonprofit called the Center for Biological Diversity, and I work there about 30 hours a week. So I have to fit my books sort of around the edges of them, and so sometimes I can write for half an hour at a time during the day, sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes if I'm lucky. But except for like 3 hours on the weekend, because I have 2 little kids, I don't get large blocks of time to work on my fiction typically. So a lot of people wouldn't enjoy that. Definitely. It works somehow, but it's tough. I wish I had longer stretches of time. I love the other work I do. I don't want to give it up. That's why I do it. But
does where you work affect all your novels, or is it just the ones that are mostly based in ecological, like disruption? And
that's a good question. I mean, I think, I work there and I write the books for the same reason, so it comes from the same place. I've been preoccupied with these kinds of matters, extinction and climate change, for a long time. I mean, since I was in my 20s. And actually with animals for longer, since I was a kid. Just always fascinated by animals, just wild creatures and all kinds of animals, really. I wrote a book of short stories called Love and Infant Monkeys. It's the only short story collection I've published that is about, each story is about a celebrity's interaction with a particular animal, and they're all based on like nonfiction accounts, so like newspaper stories and stuff like that. So when Madonna shot like a pheasant on her English estate, there's a story about that in there and stuff like that. So I've written about animals and stuff for quite a long time. Yet it comes from the same place. I think all the stuff I've written really just comes from the same place, and it's just different aspects of that. And the work that I do at the center is just it's different work because it's not creative in the same way, but it absolutely comes from the same kind of sense of urgency about some of the things happening in culture.
So going back to the book, as you were saying about animals, where did you get the idea for the animatronic animals in your book? That was an interesting setup.
I don't know. I probably got it from Disneyland or like Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that, I mean, because I think those are kind of fascinating. Animatronics are sort of creepy to me, and they're also kind of astonishing, though. Like I don't know. It seems like a technology that's still really in its infancy, right, and not sort of that sophisticated in a certain way, like a sort of primitive thing still to me. Robotics in general is, supposed to be, it's always supposed to have already happened. It's already supposed to have been, I don't know, robots are already among us and da-da-da, but then the actual things we call robots are still very primitive compared to the things we call computers, right? Like, so they haven't progressed and they haven't blown up in culture the way that computers have. And computers, I guess, are just the form of robot that we ended up with, right? Or they're the form of robot it's not the kind that actually, right? So I don't know. It's just a tiny aspect of the book, of course. But also I think that turtles move like that. Like, they move like they're not real sometimes. Just the way they're like, you're sort of like, are you maybe a machine,
Yeah, and that was a great aspect how you did that transition in the book when your main character actually sees like a real turtle for the first time. She said that it was a robot. She thought it was a robot.
She assumed it was. I mean, wouldn't you? Come on.
And I just thought that that actually kind of hit a chord with me, because I assumed that, well, turtles should look different than robots, but they don't. So
yeah,
I thought that was a pretty interesting aspect that you put into the book, and that gave a lot of tear to it.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, the only, of course, animatronics would be very expensive, right? I mean, and so the only entities with actual animatronics are like the big corporate entities, right? That put on the coral reef shows for their clients and stuff like that, and the mermaid show, I guess. And whereas, of course, the people living in the camp would never be able to afford like a huge turtle robot or anything like that, right?
I was curious if you were planning on writing a sequel for this book, because the way you left it off, I felt like there could be more.
Could be or could not be. I haven't planned one. But you're right. Like, it's sort of open-ended. Like, you could have another story about it, like taking up where that one left off. But I haven't decided to yet, anyway. I actually told my agent I would not write any more YA books or books for middle readers. Although I do have another, middle reader, the third one, there's a trilogy I have, and the third one is going to come out sometime in the next year or two of that. But this one was more conceived as a sort of one-off. It's just like sort of a labor of love, and just really, series they require a lot more calculation than I'm really good at. You have to be so, just everything has to be sort of premeditated, and that's not really my strength. I don't like having to fill in the gaps and the whys and wherefores and why does it be. It's too much work. It's like math.
Understandable.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome, you guys. Thank you. Thanks for reading my book. That's really cool.